And we're looking at romantic prose. And again, it's got, romantic art has stuff in common, obviously, with romanticism. Romantic poetry has things in common. Everything can be said about romantic art can be said about romantic poetry, plus the 8 things that we covered under that. And the same thing with romantic prose. All the stuff about romantic art and some of the stuff about romantic poetry is also true about romantic prose. All romantic work is focused on that ideal world, that cosmic battle between good and evil. So it generally has happy endings. It at least has endings with some kind of hope. Now, you might not think the Signal Man has that much of a happy ending. I mean, the guy gets run over by a train. As you'll see when we get to naturalism, that sounds almost more like naturalism. Why is that optimistic? Why isn't that such a terrible ending? The Signal Man? When he gets run over by the train?
Like the afterlife, God gives him something.
He goes on to the afterlife. He's going to be rewarded. This is the guy who got himself killed because he cared about other people. He sacrificed himself. And to the romantic, that kind of sacrifice is certain to get some sort of reward. It's a heroic ending. The endings aren't always "and they lived happily ever after," but where they're not, it's usually "and they died bravely for the good of others." And of course, the Signal Man does that. In that sense, good triumphs over evil. This guy was an ordinary guy, and again, that idea for the romantics that everybody's got an opportunity to be a hero all the time. Little events in your life give you an opportunity to do the right thing, and anytime you do the right thing, that's heroic. The good wins. In this case, it happened to cost him his life, but that's not a terrible thing for the romantics. And besides, the romantics, of course, love a good cry probably as much as they like anything, including a good laugh. So we have that cosmic battle between good and evil, and there's the sense that that there's fate, that something is directing things. That's another point that the romantics try to make, is that as you'll see when we look at realism, when we look at naturalism, it's not all just random. It doesn't just happen. There's some divine intelligence behind it, and that intelligence is generally benevolent. There's a struggle between good and evil, and it doesn't always look like good wins, but that's so that we have some opportunity to be heroic. Also, the story is optimistic because he knew what was going to happen next. Both of them had an insight into the future. They both had an instance of precognition. They both knew things that were going to happen. That means things are pretty much fated to happen. And fate implies that there's somebody directing it. And so that's an uplifting idea for the romantics. Remember when we looked last week at the characters in the Signal Man? They were both idealistic. You have the Signal Man himself, who is the dutiful employee, the guy who cares about other people, the responsible person. He had opportunities to do well in life, but he said he threw them away himself, and he's not bitter about that. He accepts that idea that good gets rewarded and evil gets punished. He's not really worried about losing his job. He's worried about not being there to prevent the accident. Some terrible tragedy is going to occur. He's seen this ghost now. This is the 3rd time he's seen it. And every time it comes, there's some sort of tragedy. The big train wreck, young girl choking to death on the train, and he thinks, why would it come to me and warn me about something if I couldn't do anything about it? The first 2 times must have been so that I would know that it was a warning, so that when the really important thing came, I would take heed of that warning and I would be able to prevent it. But he just can't figure out what it is. And he's tormented by that. Most people not being heroic would just say, well, I don't know, I can't figure it out. I guess I'll figure it out after it happens. And they start bringing the bodies through again, or whatever colossal disaster is going to be. But he doesn't. He's tortured by this idea that people are going to be hurt. Other people, total strangers, people he doesn't know at all. Remember, he's about as responsible as you can get. He's in that little, right outside that tunnel, in that railroad cutting. It's down below the level of the ground. It's clammy, it's damp, it's pretty dim down there. It's not a nice place to be. And yet he doesn't come up into the sunlight because he's afraid he'll miss that bell. He's afraid he'll miss some sort of a call. If he doesn't throw the right switches, the trains will crash into one another. It's not a real high-paying job. He's not the CEO of the railroad. But if he makes a mistake, people die. And he's so concerned about that he doesn't even take his breaks. So again, he's the good guy. How's the narrator the good guy?
Narrator helps the signalman.
He helps the signalman, total stranger. No reason for him to help him. This is even more significant because this is 19th century and it's England. And the narrator is a gentleman. Notice we don't have any reference to his job at all. So he's got money. And generally, gentlemen didn't hobnob with the working class. But this is a guy who hasn't got any of that arrogance that the upper class normally has. Not only is he willing to talk to anybody, but he goes out of his way. He thinks, well, that guy's probably pretty lonely down there, and I'm sure nobody goes down and talks to him, and he could probably use somebody to talk to. Don't forget, there's far less distractions in the 19th century. When the guy hasn't got a little television set in his booth that he can look at, he hasn't got a radio, he's just down there by himself. He can't even read that much because he's always worried that there's going to be something with the trains that he's going to have to do. So the narrator goes down to talk to him. And when he finds out his problem, he doesn't abandon him. When he starts to think this guy may be crazy, he doesn't run away. He stays there and tries to find out what the problem is and says to him, we'll find some sort of solution. I mean, there's an implication there. He's going to pay for that doctor. He says, we'll go, I'll come back for you after your shift. We'll go and we'll see the best doctor we can find, and we'll get some kind of an explanation for this. So again, he's going out of his way to help other people. He's the good guy. He's the good friend. Even though he's worried that the signalman may make a mistake and people might get killed, he still can't turn the signalman in. Why not? Why can't he call up the railroad and go, you got a guy down there directing trains that's losing it. There may be an accident. Why can't he tell the railroad about it?
He's a good friend.
He's a good friend. You can't betray a confidence. And that guy told him his problem. You can't go and get him fired because of that. So instead, he tries to find some solution that'll satisfy both everybody's safety and take care of the signalman. And he's got no reason or obligation to care about this guy at all. He should, other than the obligation that the romantic feels all of us have to help one another. And so he does. He goes out of his way to do that. So in that one, at least, you have two idealized characters, and if anything, they're really both the heroes. There's no real villain in this story, which is kind of unusual for a romantic story. As you saw in Poe, the story's told in the first person. Now, the romantics, you remember, want to stir up your emotions. And to do that, they stir up your sensations quite often. Well, the easiest way to stir up people's sensations isn't to have a disembodied voice describe stuff or describe somebody else's feelings. It's to tell you about their own feeling. That's about as close as you can get to somebody else's feelings, is them telling you how they feel. So generally you have a first-person narrative because that increases the emotion and it increases the sensation. It also gives you an idea of listening to somebody, so there's more of a personal involvement. But the whole time that the author is telling you the story as this character that he creates, I mean, Dickens didn't really go wandering around talking to signalmen. I mean, he might have. Dickens was a guy who had, his father had been in the Navy as a kind of clerk, and then he lost his job. they were bankrupt, and Dickens had to go to work in a factory that was just had all kind of rats, and it was this tumble-down building by the water. And he was 12, and he had to go to work when he was 12 to support the family. So he's a guy who knows, even though he got rich later, and he was the most famous writer in England, and he made a lot of money, he never forgot that he had done hard work in terrible conditions. And so he would have gone down and talked with the guy. But at the same time, that this narrator is telling us the story and seeming to be so forthright, he's manipulating us all along. I mean, the narrator knows the punchline to that story, that the narrator had a precognitive moment too, that he heard something whenever the signal man made that gesture in his own mind. He heard, "For God's sake, clear the way." And when we get to the end of the accident, we find out that's exactly what the engineer of the train said. The signal man didn't tell him that, so the signal man had precognition of what was going to come, and the narrator does. But he doesn't tell us that right off the bat. In fact, he's manipulating us all the way through. Right from the very beginning, when he calls down, "Hello, below there," and the signal man is upset, and instead of looking up, he looks over at the tunnel, which is a strange thing for him to do. So that raises a question in our mind right away, that what is it that's going on here? Why didn't this guy react the way we would expect him to react? Why didn't he look up? And then we only find 4 or 5 pages later that the signal man's been plagued by this ghost, that he always hears "hello" below there whenever he sees it. So when he hears somebody else say that, he thinks it must be the ghost, so he doesn't look up to where the narrator is. And in fact, we don't even find out that was what upset him until 2 or 3 pages later, when the narrator's going to leave for the night, and the signal man says to him, "Why did you call out 'hello' below there?" And the narrator says, "Well, I said something like that." And the guy says, "No, you said exactly those words. Why did you use those words?" "I don't know, that's just what you would call out." "No other reason?" "No." So the signal man is asking him, "Are you part of this supernatural plot that seems to be going on here? Have you got something to do with the ghost?" Of course, at that point, the narrator doesn't really know anything about the ghost. But right from the beginning, we have these questions raised that don't get answered to the end. Now, when you get to the end of a romantic story, all the loose ends get tied up. We find out what happens to the signal man. We find out what happens to the narrator. We find out what happens to everybody of importance in the story. All our questions get answered. Because one of the things the romantic is trying to tell you is that the world is directed by some sort of intelligence, that everybody's life makes some sort of sense, that it's all part of this grand plan. And when you die, the romantic thinks that you're going to find out why you were here, why everything that happened to you happened to you, where you fit into this great cosmic plan, and what it was all about in general. And so when they get to the end of the story does the same thing. It tells you what it was all about. Even when it leaves an air of mystery, as the signal man does, it still ties up all the factual loose ends for us. Because the author is saying to us, look, it all makes sense. The world makes sense. Another way that the author manipulates the reader is by stirring up his senses. So that if you look at the next thing, number 4, long, flowery descriptions with heavy emphasis on sensation. And number 5, an attempt to control the reader's emotional response, often through authorial comment. In other words, the author tells you either how he's feeling to make you feel the same way, or he writes a description that hints at what your feelings ought to be. He's trying to control your emotions. And of course, he's trying to control them so he can stir them up so that you can overcome your intellect, which has kept you from feeling things. Generally, when you look at a romantic story, you get descriptions that look like the guy's being paid by the word. Every time you've got a noun, you usually got 2 or 3 adjectives in front of it. and many of them will have emotional significance. For example, when he's looking down into the railroad cutting, right in the very beginning of the story. There, by dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough zigzag descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitous. Notice it can't just be deep, it has to be extremely deep. It isn't not just steep, but it has to be unusually steep. It was made to a clammy stone. Often when writers write description, they appeal solely to your sense of vision. But the romantic writer wants to stir up as many of your senses as he can. In fact, probably the sense of vision of all your senses, that's the one that's most under the control of your intellect, because you got to see to read. The others, the intellect has less control over. So the more you stir up the collateral senses, the more likely you are to be able to stir those emotions up and get past the intellect. Through a clammy stone, they became oozier and wetter as I went down. Again, the tactile sense, the sense of feeling. For these reasons, I found the way long enough to give me time to recall a singular air of reluctance or compulsion with which he had pointed out the path. So now we have there's a feeling in the narrator that there's something wrong here. Why did the signalman act like he was being compelled to show him the path down? Why was he reluctant? Why doesn't he want to visit him? When he comes down to him, he was a dark, sallow man with a heavy beard and rather heavy eyebrows. Now, those, of course, visual. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. Solitary is a word that has emotional connotation. Would you like to be solitary? No, it implies loneliness. So that tells you this is a lonely place. And dismal. It's dim. It's depressing. So he expects you to be a little bit depressed. As ever I saw, on either side, a dripping wet wall. You notice earlier he told us it was oozy and clammy. He's already given us that information. He brings it back to emphasize it. Of jagged stone, again that tactile sense, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective one way, only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. Now again, dungeons have a whole lot of negative connotations. Who gets kept in dungeons?
Prisoners.
Prisoners. So the signalman is like a prisoner there. It's been chained up in the bottom of a castle. Nobody even knows that he's there. And he can't get out. There are these same cold, clammy stone walls that you can't escape from, that you would find in a dungeon. So we're supposed to feel sorry for him. The shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel. Notice gloomy and gloomier are telling you how you should feel. In whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, uncivilized, vaguely threatening, depressing, been working on sadness all the way through, and forbidding air. It's a little bit scary. Notice how many emotions he's working on at the same time, trying to stir up as many as he can. If he can't get one of your emotions going, like some people it's easier to make them frightened than it is to make them unhappy. Other people it's easier to make them pity somebody else than it is to make them angry. So he's trying to do a range of emotions here so that he can at least get one of them that's going to work. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell. Again, you don't find very many writers who bring in the sense of smell. Not American writers, anyway. So this place smells dead. It's filled with decay. It's almost like descending into a grave. So much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me as if I had left the natural world. This place isn't just cold. It's cold in a supernatural kind of way. The chills that he has aren't just because it's wet and it's damp and it's chilly. It's also because when he goes down there, the hair on his back of his neck is starting to rise. This is somehow a scary place. And of course, the Romantics love scary places. They like that wild nature, things that were out of man's control. The idea of the sublime, why they found thunderstorms and things so dramatic and so emotionally affecting to them, is because it's this power that's behind everything, that's so majestic and so huge that you have no possible hope of controlling it. And yet, it's not necessarily destructive. It's part of the natural order of things. The Romantics accepted that the world isn't supposed to be all good. It's not supposed to be all nice, and it's not supposed to be all easy. It's supposed to be filled with difficulties. The difficulties are our opportunities to sharpen our character, to make something out of ourselves, to make somebody out of ourselves. Nothing that comes easy is worth very much. The stuff which often has no extrinsic value at all, but which you work really hard for, has a huge value. And so that's one of the things that he's trying to point out. The signal man's a little bit scary to him. There was something in the man that daunted me. The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and saturnine face that this was a spirit, not a man. And as soon as that, it's almost like it's such a haunted place. As soon as you go in it, you start seeing everything as a ghost. Even the signal man seems somehow supernatural. He's not sure he's talking to a real person. Now he thinks that the guy seems to be very meticulous, and he works really hard at this job, and he pays a lot of attention to detail, which is what you want him to do if you were riding those railroads. But he starts to, and he's got the feeling, but the feeling just sort of builds up over time. And it gets a little bit creepier the longer he goes on. He begins to notice there's something wrong here. I should have set this man down as one of the safest men to be employed in that capacity. But for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a fallen color. The color drained out of his face. He became pale, which is what happens when you're frightened. Turned his face towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. What is it he's looking out for? Looking out for well, he knows there are trains coming, but this is more than that.
The ghost.
The ghost. He's looking out for the ghost. The bell doesn't ring, but whenever the ghost comes, he hears a bell. So it's a supernatural bell. So you're talking to somebody, and they keep looking at the phone and picking it up and listening to see if somebody's there and putting it down again. What would you think? You'd think they're crazy. And he's beginning to wonder about this guy. And I mean, think of his position. He's down in this railroad cutting. Nobody knows he's down there. You wouldn't be heard if you screamed. To run away, there's really no place to go except into the tunnel. And there's probably no way out of that cutting on the other side. Easier. And the only place here is that little narrow path. So I mean, if you decided this guy was crazy and he was somebody had a pole and was going to kill you for some reason, there's nowhere to go. Plus, he's in this little tiny room, almost knee to knee with the guy. You start realizing you're that close to somebody who isn't all there. That's a pretty scary circumstance. And yet he doesn't bolt. He doesn't try to leave him. Instead, he tries to find out what's wrong. When he leaves, there are those same supernatural feelings. The guy asked him why he said hello below there, and he said there was no reason. He wished me good night and held up his light. I walked by the sight of the down line of rails with a very disagreeable sensation of a train coming behind me till I found the path. What happens at the end of the story?
Gets hit by a train.
Gets hit by a train. It comes up from him from behind. So here's another premonition. Now this, again, we've seen a lot of Twilight Zone episodes, so this isn't nearly as spooky as to us as it was to readers in the 19th century. One, they're much more open to their sensations than we are. They often read books and poems and cried about them. Most modern people don't do that very often. But it was commonplace for the Romantics. So they're much more open to their emotions than we are. And they haven't seen 1,000 television shows based on the Twilight Zone. This is something that is scary to them. When you believe there's a supernatural world, you're much more likely to see supernatural things. And when you're not distracted by artificial kinds of entertainment like television, you pay a lot of attention to the real world. And so you start noting little oddities and discrepancies. So they were always responding to the world with their feelings and often coming to places that were kind of upsetting to them. When the signalman describes the ghost to him, you notice that the very things that get brought back at the end get mentioned earlier. So he asked him if he knows who it is. I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face and the right arm is waved, violently waved this way. I followed his action with my eyes. It was the action of a man gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence. For God's sake, clear the way. And you notice that the signalman doesn't say that. The narrator just applies that in his mind when he sees that gesture. One moonlit night, said the man, I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, hello, below there. I started up looking for that door and saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting and it cried, look out, look out. And then again, hello, below there, look out. I caught out my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, what's wrong? What has happened? Where? It just stood outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered it's keeping its sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up to it and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away when it was gone. Into the tunnel? I said, no, I ran into the tunnel 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head and saw the figures of the measured distance and saw the wet stains stealing down the walls, trickling through the arch. Does that sound like a sentence somebody would actually say in conversation? No. One of the things about romantic dialogue is that it isn't realistic. It isn't the way people would talk. I mean, if this was a realist writing this story, he would say, did you know the guy? No. I ran up to him and I put my hand out and he disappeared. Where'd he go? Did he go in the tunnel? No. That's all we get. We wouldn't get this description of what the tunnel is like and how scary it was in there. But it doesn't matter. It's another one of those ways that the romantic author is manipulating his reader. And the readers at the time, although their dialogue, 19th century people spoke much more formally, even to their intimates, than we do. But still, it's not this formal, and people weren't that descriptive. But the author needs to do that in order to create the scene for you. I ran out again faster than I'd run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me. Now, after he tells him this, although the narrator is going to try to find some rational explanation, his first response is emotional. Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger, tracing out my spine, I showed him how this figure must be a deception of his sight. Even when his reason is being employed, the narrator's still starting to get afraid. Those chills are running up his back. Then the signalman tells him about the girl. About the crash on the line. Within 10 hours, the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over that spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. It was not to be denied, I rejoined, that this was a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress the mind, but it was unquestionably that remarkable coincidence did continually occur. So in other words, he's using his reason and saying, well, yeah, it just happened. But that kind of stuff, coincidences happen all the time. Is coincidence an explanation for things? No. All coincidence says is two things coincide. Two things happened at the same time. There's no explanation for why they happen. In a random universe, they shouldn't happen. But they do. So even when he gives this reason, this rational argument against this being a ghost, nevertheless, a disagreeable shudder crept over him. So he tells you he's afraid, and that's a way to attempt to make you afraid. Every time the signal man tells him something scary, he tries to explain it away, but at the same time you have an emotional response that tells you he really believes it. Then he tells them about the young girl dying in the train. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments and was brought in here and laid on this floor. Involuntarily, I pushed my chair back as I looked from the floorboards at which he pointed to himself. True, sir, true, precisely as it happened, so I tell you. Why did he move his chair back when the guy says, and that's where we put her body?
It was a spot where she died.
Yeah, that was the spot where she died. Death had occurred there. For the Romantics, remember the things that happen in this world somehow get stuck to the surroundings. That's the fact that somebody died there means that's always going to be a place that's supernaturally different from everywhere else. And so he's frightened by it and he moves back. And then of course he tries to think about something to say, but this time he can't even find something to make up. I could think of nothing to say to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. When does your mouth get dry?
You get scared.
When you're scared. The wind and the wires took up the story with a long lamenting wail. Notice how nature always comes into the story to help set the emotional tone. So now there's the wailing of the wind. So he shows them the same gesture again, and he keeps telling below, below there, look out, look out. That gets repeated about 4 times in the story, so that when we come to the end of the story, you're not going to miss it. Again, it's the author manipulating it. Another description, which is a typical Romantic description. There was the danger light, there was the dismal mouth of the tunnel, the high, wet stone walls of the cutting. Notice again those appeals to the senses. And then on page 11 we have the intense emotional response of the signalman to his frustration. He doesn't know what he's being warned about. He doesn't know who it is he's supposed to warn. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do. And it's tormenting him. Because he knows somebody's going to die if he can't figure this out. The pain of his mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. This is a guy that knows somebody's going to be killed, and he knows he can stop it if only he can figure out what it is, and he can't figure it out. And he can't tell anybody else about it because there's nothing that he can tell them. So when he leaves, he says he's going to come back and take the signalman to the doctor. He's going to find a rational explanation for things. But of course, when he comes back, it's already too late. He gets back a little bit early. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink, to the edge of that deep railroad cutting. I mechanically looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment. For in a moment I saw this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. Again, you get the rational coming back in, but the first response is always an emotional one. When he sees that, what does he think he's looking at? The ghost. He believes there are ghosts too. Even though he's supposed to be the reasonable man, and even though he's offering all these rational explanations, deep down he believes in the supernatural too. And he keeps having these precognitions. He has these feelings. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing self-reproach of fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notched path with all the speed that I could make. So he's got another precognition. Something's wrong here. There's no reason for him to be I mean, he does worry that maybe the signalman caused an accident of some sort, or if there's something wrong, but it's a feeling again. It isn't presented as a rational series of deductions. In other words, he doesn't look down and say, this place is always empty. There are people in it now. They seem to be talking about something important, something serious has happened. Instead, he tells you it's a feeling that he has, that there's something wrong here. He goes down and asks the man, what's the matter? Signalman killed this morning, sir. Not the man belonging to that box. Yes, sir. Not the man I know. You'll recognize him if you know him, said the man who spoke to the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarpaulin. He had described it earlier about there being like against its shaft, the danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft, a little low hut, entirely new to me, was made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. So they lift up the tarpaulin, raising the end of the tarpaulin, for his face is quite composed. A guy's just been run over by a train. Apparently the people there are investigating the accident. There's a witness, and there are two other people there who are finding out what's going on. A total stranger shows up and asks what happened here. In real life, would he get an answer? No, they tell him, none of your business, be on your way, you're interfering here. Stop rubbernecking, go on back up there. You have no business here. They tell him about it. They let him interview the witness. They show him the corpse. You show up in a traffic accident where somebody's been killed, the police don't go. Is it somebody I know? Well, you want to take a look? You know who this is? No, okay. Have a nice day. It doesn't happen. And it probably didn't even happen. Now, it would have happened a little bit more in Dickens's day because this guy is a gentleman. And the working class were very deferential to the, remember this is England, and so having money and having social position, everybody is deferential to that. They might have told him stuff because he was a gentleman. Actually, as a matter of fact, if there is an accident and you walk over and ask what went on, the cops will send you away. But if I walk over in my suit and tie and ask what went on, they might give me an answer. So it's kind of like that. A guy shows up who's obviously not, he's dressed like a gentleman. He wants to know what's going on. They think, well, maybe this guy's from the railroad, so maybe that's the reason why they give him the answer. But the real reason at the bottom is because Dickens has to give us all this information. The most dramatic way to do it is to have the witnesses tell you firsthand so that the narrator can respond to it. And so it's a technique, it's a trick to manipulate the reader. But it's one he needs to do. Now there's another thing about realism. This guy's been hit by a steam locomotive from behind. Even if the steam locomotive was slowing down, what will he look like?
A mess.
He'll be a mess. I mean, this thing weighs tons. Even if you move something weighing tons at 10 miles an hour, it'll just splatter anything soft as a human body that it runs into. And you notice you can see the expression on his face. They'd have been washing pieces of him off the wall in real life. He wouldn't have been perfectly composed. That isn't a body anybody would have been allowed to look at. But he has to be in perfect shape because we have to know that he's completely at peace now.
Or pieces.
Or in reality, he would have been in pieces. In Romanticism, he's at peace. His face is perfectly composed. There's a little smile on his face. Why is he smiling?
Because he saved the train.
He's found out what it was. Other people didn't die. His last thought had to be, it's me. That's what the tragedy is going to be. I didn't let everybody down. It was my fate it was warning me about. He doesn't, he's not, I should have figured this out, I'd have lived. This shows you what a good guy he is. Other people aren't going to die. There isn't going to be another big train wreck. And he's figured it out. The world makes sense to him. Now again, he gets to interview the witnesses. He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better. But somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. That man drove her and was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom. The man who wore a rough, dark dress stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir, he said, I saw him at the end, like as if I saw him down a perspective glass. There was no time to check speed, and I knew him to be very careful. As he didn't take heed of the whistle, I shut it off when we were running down upon him and called out as loud as I could call. They're in a tunnel. What will it... Now, if you've been next to a railroad track and ever heard a steam engine's whistle, it's really loud. What would it sound like in the tunnel?
Echo.
Yeah, it would echo, be magnified, it'd be 10 times as loud as that. And yet the guy doesn't hear it. There's a big steam engine coming up behind him and he doesn't hear it. How come he doesn't hear it? Because he's so preoccupied. Apparently he's seen the ghost. Why else would he be in the tunnel? Unless he had seen the ghost and followed it in there. He wouldn't just go in the tunnel. The tunnel scares him. The last time he was in there, he was so frightened he ran out. So he must have seen the ghost and gone in the tunnel. And he's still trying to figure out, what is it trying to tell me? What is it trying to tell me? And he's thinking about that so hard, he doesn't hear anything. He's oblivious even to that deafening train whistle. What did you say? I said, below there, look out, for God's sake, clear the way. I started. It means he was startled. Why is he startled?
He was going to kill him.
Well, not the signal man. Why is the narrator startled when he hears that this guy said, for God's sake, clear the way?
Because he heard him say before.
That's what he's been hearing all along, every time they tell him about the ghost. So he realizes he had precognition as well. Oh, it was a dreadful time, so I never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes not to see, and I waved this arm to the last, but it was no use. Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than another, I may, in closing, point out that the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, hello, below there, look out, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached, and that only in my mind, to the gesticulation he imitated. God say, clear the way. That's when it do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. We find out he's been in the twilight zone. Again, it's a story about the supernatural because it's supposed to stir up your emotion. This story is supposed to be read at night, by yourself, by candlelight, preferably when there's a storm raging outside or the wind is blowing and rattling the shutters. The romantics love to scare themselves. Even though ultimately it proves that there is a divine will guiding events, it's still kind of scary when you deal with the supernatural. They believed in ghosts, and that proves to them there's a life after death. The ghosts aren't always good. It's not all Casper the Friendly Ghost. They believed most ghosts were malevolent. They had died under violent circumstances, and they either couldn't tell that they were dead and so were striking out at any of the living, or they were so angry at being dead that they wanted to get back at the living. So to them, ghosts were a scary thing. Not that they aren't a scary thing now. I mean, they're still making horror movies about ghosts, even in the 21st century. Even with all the science we believe in, tons of people still go to see ghost stories and get frightened by them. And it's not all only the young. Complex plotting with closure. Again, right from the beginning, a question is raised, evidence is given to us slowly, so we put it all together, and when we get to the end, it's all explained for us. It's all laid out. That's what closure is. All the loose ends are tied up. Cosmic supernatural landscapes. When he describes the world, it isn't just the world. It's the supernatural world, the cosmic world, shining through the physical world. It's not just that the place is clammy, it's It's also gives you chills because it's supernatural. Enthusiastic. The author is the narrator. I take that back, not the author. The narrator. There's a difference. The author is the guy that writes the story. The narrator is the character who is created to tell the story. The character may have a lot in common with the autobiographical author, but he's not the author. We can't always trust him. He's emotionally involved in this. This guy can't wait to tell us this story. It's his brush with the supernatural. And he's never forgotten it. It's changed his life. So he's emotionally involved in what he's telling you. And this is true for all of the romantic stories. And finally, every writer wants to write the truth. The measure of truth for a romantic writer is that you have symbolic action. The events stand for something else, almost always something to do with good and evil. And the verification of that truth is intuitive. In other words, you read this story, if it puts chills up your back or down your back, then you know it's true. The measure of truth for the romantics is emotional. Truth feels true. So in other words, if this were a contrived story, it wouldn't work. Even though it's fiction and it's made up, Dickens is drawing on some supernatural event in his life. This is you believe that this is a guy who really did have some precognition. I can't remember the exact instances now, but there were several times in Dickens's life when he knew that a thing was going to happen. Of course, that's true of everybody. Nevertheless, this feels true, and that's the romantic's measure whether a thing is true or not. It feels true. Doesn't matter what your intellect tells you. That a guy getting hit by a train is going to be torn apart, and yet he's perfectly composed. Your intellect tells you that's not the case, but emotionally you feel like the story is true, that we have these brushes with the supernatural. Anybody have any comments on the Signal Man? If you look at the Black Cat, you can see a lot of things which are very similar to what's done in the Signal Man. Now in this case you have a villain. What is his crime?
Killing his wife.
He murders his wife. Kills his wife, then he walls up her body. Is he entirely evil, or is there some sympathy for him in this story? How did he get to be so evil? I mean, when we first get introduced to him, he's not a bad guy. He's an alcoholic. He starts to drink, and that makes him mean. He becomes violent. Before that, from my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. So he loves animals. He's so kind and he's so nice, people even laugh at him. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, it need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. So what's he saying there about dogs? They're faithful. Dogs love you, they don't betray you. What about people?
Not as faithful.
People aren't as faithful. People that you think love you sometimes turn out not to. Even the people who love you will sacrifice you for their own ends at times. The dog won't do that. Because when the dog loves you, you know the dog. Your family's happy to see you when you come home. But if you got a dog, the dog is overjoyed. The dog is wagging his tail and jumping around. I think the dog actually thinks that we all die when we leave. And so when we come back, it's like we're coming back from the dead. Oh, I thought you died, you're back. Oh, this is so great. That the same with all animals? Cats the same?
No.
No. Cats are going, oh, it's you. The food dish is empty. Hey, hey. The dog is just happy to see. I mean, the dog wants to be fed too, but the dog, even if you're not feeding him, the dog is happy to see you. Nobody actually owns a cat. Cats stay with you. They're there temporarily. Don't offend them, though. You offend them, they're gone. No, I won't put up with that. It's not in the contract. I'm hanging out here because you got thumbs, pal. It's nothing personal. The dog loves you. So he says, you know, and the dog loved him, and he loved this dog, and he loves animals. So he's a kind-hearted person. I'm a romantic. Even if you're not a romantic, you may have a pet. If you got a pet, they're not human beings, but they are people. They have personalities, and you form pretty strong attachments to them. And the romantics, that would be even more so. And the fact that he's talking about the dog in terms of its innocent love. And that would be a high ideal for the romantics. So the romantics, initially, their response to reading the story is that this is a really good guy. You notice that he's actually a really crazy guy. I mean, he's a murderer. He's a homicidal maniac. But you don't know that at first. That enthusiasm, though, of the story comes out right away. I mean, we can tell that he's upset. But at first, we don't know that he's crazy. For the most part, mild, yet mostly homely narrative, which I'm about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be if I expected it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely I do not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly and succinctly, without any comment, a series of mere household events. And their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me they have presented little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than Baroque's. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than the ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. Do you notice how it sort of runs? The more he tells you, I'm going to tell you something, but I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm sure it makes sense to somebody, but it's torturing and tormenting me. When somebody tells you I'm being tortured and tormented, you have an emotional response to that. You feel bad for them. So automatically we're on the side of the narrator. We have no idea what he's done yet. Then he tells us what a nice guy he was. And again, he does look like the good guy. He's got this beautiful little wife with a wonderful disposition. Notice he doesn't tell you that she's beautiful. He tells you what a nice person he is. He's a nice guy. He married a real nice woman. They have all kinds of pets, goldfish and dogs and rabbits and a monkey and a cat. And the fact that you love animals makes you a good person as far as the romantics are concerned. So these are the good guys. And he has this beautiful black cat. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, what did they think of women at the time anyway? Were they intellects or were they emotional?
Emotional.
They were emotional. So, and emotion, superstition generally goes along with emotion. So he says, well, she was kind of what you'd expect from a woman. She was a little bit superstitious. And this was a black cat. What's the significance of black cats?
Bad luck.
It's supposed to be bad luck. Whenever you see, when they do any movies with witches in them, the witch has their familiar. The spirit that they conjure up goes into the animal. And what's the animal almost all of the time?
Black.
A black cat. And a black cat almost all of the time. So the fact that he's got a black cat made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. The idea is that the black cat was the familiar of the witch. It was the spirit that she sent out, or he sent out, and that they could change themselves into black cats as well. Not that she was serious upon this point, and I mention the matter for no reason better than it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, remember Pluto from neoclassicism, he's the lord of the dead. So they gave this cat, black cat, Death as a name. And at first, they get along great. The cat loves him, he loves the cat. Our friendship lasted, and the cat wants to follow him everywhere. The cat loves him, likes to be with him all the time. Our friendship lasted in this matter for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, drunkenness, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. You notice here you have emotions, but they're all negative. It's the emotions gone bad. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. Oh, they got along perfectly before. Now they fight and he swears at her. At length, I even offered her personal violence. He threatens to hit her. My pets, of course, were made to feel a change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of mistreating the rabbits, the monkey, even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? At length, even Pluto, now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. What do you think of a guy that torments animals?
Horrible.
He's a terrible person. Is it his fault?
No.
19th century was real big on alcoholism as something evil. Women's Christian Temperance Union. Americans were major league drinkers, and there were always campaigns to try to stop people from drinking. And one of the things that they did was people would get up and tell horror stories about the awful things that drinking had made them do. This fits in a kind of literature which was commonplace at the time called temperance literature. The difference is it's not just mere confession. There's also elements of the supernatural in the story.
AA means of the past. AA means of the past.
AA what?
Alcoholics Anonymous means.
Oh, meanings of the past. Yeah, it is the beginning of AA. But this is a guy this is right, it's exactly what they would do. Stand up and tell their story. This is the awful things that drink made me do, and this is why I don't want to drink anymore, and I want you to help me. Except the narrator here is going to be hanged tomorrow for what he's done. Now we see alcoholism as a disease. It's the inability to metabolize alcohol is one of the reasons why people become addicted to it. Everybody who drinks doesn't become addicted to alcohol. Of course, there is that theory that everybody lacks certain brain chemicals. And if you come across the artificial analog of those chemicals which your brain is lacking, you will be addicted. In other words, if you don't have enough adrenaline, you're probably going to be an alcoholic, or you're going to be an excitement junkie. You're going to take part in the X Games all the time. You're going to keep putting yourself in danger because that's how you get your body to produce the adrenaline you need. If you don't have enough monoamine oxidase, which at the synapse eats the stuff that makes the nerve impulses pass, it floods into the synapse, that gets taken back up by a chemical. That's monoamine oxidase. If you don't have enough of that, and you smoke marijuana, you're going to get way more stoned than anybody else, and you're going to have a real problem with that drug, because that's a drug your body lacks. And there's a doctor, I can't remember his name, from State University of New York, who had taken each of the recreational drugs and showed how it was a brain analog. And if you're lacking in that, you're going to be addicted to that drug. So the modern view of alcoholism is that it's a disease and a progressive disease. But they didn't think that in the 19th century. They thought alcoholism and all drug addiction was a lack of willpower, that you were a bad person, that a strong, good, upright, moral person couldn't get addicted to anything. So he's way ahead of his time in talking about it as a disease. Let's take a break till 3 o'clock, and I'll get you the stories for naturalism. So with the black cat, he starts out as a good guy. The real villain in the story is alcohol. But it still turns him into a monstrous person. Notice he's mean to his wife, then he threatens to harm her, and he starts to torture the animals. And he says himself that he's really just deteriorated as a person, and it's all really because of alcohol. So first we feel sorry for him, until we get to the next paragraph. I mean, starts out a nice guy, so naturally we're rooting for him. Then he gets involved with alcohol, and he can't help himself, and we still feel a little bit sorry for him. But I think we lose all sympathy for him when we get to that next paragraph. One night returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut out one of his eyes from its socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder when I pen the damnable atrocity. Okay, he feels real bad about it now. Is that enough for the reader to forgive him?
No.
No, probably not. I mean, this guy is obviously a terrible person, or he's crazy. And we're beginning to think probably crazy. Even though he doesn't say that he's crazy. He'd rather we believe that he's an alcoholic, and that's what's making him do it, than that he's lost his mind. This is kind of typical with Poe. You remember we also saw it with Browning and Porphyria's Lover. The madman is a common figure in Romanticism, because when you live in your emotions, it's easy to go too far. The intellect doesn't intervene. So that anybody who's really sensitive always runs the risk of being destroyed by that sensitivity and going over the line into madness. When I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was at best a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. Remember, we're here to do the right thing. We have our feelings, and our feelings tell us what's wrong. So at first, his feelings are stirred up by what he did. It's a horrible thought. But then he just gets drunk again and forgets about it. And it doesn't really touch his soul, so that he hasn't opened himself up to it. And this is, of course, the recipe for disaster for the romantic. Not following your heart. If he had really opened up to his emotions, he'd have seen what a terrible thing that he did, and he would have changed. But he doesn't. He hardens his heart. Anytime somebody hardens their heart in romanticism, there's always going to be a tragedy to follow. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance. But he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first aggrieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once loved me. But then it came to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. And he's real big on this idea of perverseness. And basically, it's the one thing that you know you absolutely shouldn't do becomes irresistible. Later on, it's similar to what Conrad would be talking about when he talks about the fascination of the abomination. As soon as something is so horrible and so terrible, you're not supposed to have anything to do with it, it immediately becomes attractive. It's the same way with perversity. It's as if we want to destroy ourselves. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the most indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself for committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? It is this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to humiliate itself, to harm itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrongs for wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally consummate the injury I had indicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped the noose about its neck and hung it to a limb of a tree. Hung it with tears streaming from my eyes, with the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it loved me, because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in doing so I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and terrible God. So why does he hang the cat?
Feel sorry for the cat.
We feel sorry that he's doing it. That ought to keep him from doing it.
He wants to be punished.
That's a good point. Maybe it is part of the, if he took the idea of perversity further, maybe the roots of perverseness in human nature is really guilt. He feels bad about himself. The cat still loves him. He cuts its eye out because it still loves him. He doesn't deserve to be loved. He knows that. He can't stand the fact that anybody does love him. So he attacks the cat. And then when he hangs it, he says it's out of that sheer perversity, that instinct people have for doing the wrong thing. You know you're not supposed to do what it is, and simply because you're not supposed to do it, it becomes irresistible not to do it. And the whole time he's hanging it, he feels terrible. He knows this is an awful thing, but he can't help himself. Well, that's not alcoholism, that's madness. That's compulsion. By this point, we ought to know this guy is crazy. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. So he gives up on himself. And he's wasting all of his money in drugs, in alcohol. Then the house catches fire. And he manages to escape, and his wife manages to escape. And he goes back. And here we have another one of those Twilight Zone things. I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here in great measure resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager attention. The word strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas-relief, that's that raised kind of sculpture, upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarce regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. So now there's the picture of a cat. The house catches fire. This is supposed to be the cat's revenge. It's really an evil spirit. Now he's starting to see that the cat isn't a cat at all. That his wife, which he hinted at earlier, that it could be the familiar of a witch, that it's actually demonic. So what does that tell you about his mental state?
He's kind of insane.
He gets crazier by the paragraph. I mean, he says everybody was looking at it and saying, oh, that's strange, that's odd. They may have just been saying, well, that wall is still up. That's strange and odd. Nobody mentions a cat. It's only when he looks at it that it becomes the cat. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression on my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during the period there came back into my spirit a half sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, to look about me among the vile haunts which are now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species, and a somewhat similar appearance with which to supply its place. So he's not sorry for what he did, but he regrets missing the cat, so now he's going to go and get another cat. You'd think with the trouble he's having with cats, he would leave cats alone. But this is that spirit of perverseness. What's the worst thing a guy who has a fixation on cats could do? Get himself another cat. So what's the one thing he's absolutely going to do? Get himself another cat. And of course he implies that it isn't just coincidence that these cats show up. This is a special demonic cat. One night as I sat half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing on the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of the hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I no sooner perceived the object thereupon, I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but for one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white covering nearly the whole region of his breast. So there's not just another cat, but a black cat. So he takes the cat home with him. And notice that at first the white thing around its neck was just an indistinct blotch. What is it going to turn into?
Black.
It's going to turn into the shape of a rope. And he's going to see this is the cat come back and it's still got the marks of his murder upon it. So he takes this cat home and then he starts to hate the cat again. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising with me. This was just the reverse of what I anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose to the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not for some weeks strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with an unutterable loathing and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added no doubt to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it had also been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endured it to my wife, who, as I already said, possessed in a high degree the humanity of feeling, which had once been my distinguishing trait, the source of many of my simplest, most purest pleasures. Why bring in that part about the cat's only got one eye, so his wife loves it even more? What does that tell you about it?
Feel sorry for a cat.
She feels for it. She's a really nice person. She doesn't deserve what's going to happen to her. You know, if he had a wife that he was fighting with all the time and that he felt nagged him and was always belittling him, when he finally chops her in the head with the axe, we would feel he shouldn't have done that, but a little part of us would say, yeah, but on the other hand, she did ask for it. But this is not the case. There's absolutely no reason. This is the slaughter of innocence, this murder. It's the death of the good. Remember, everything is symbolic. So he has to play her up as good as he possibly can. First, now he hates the cat, and he can't stand being around it, but he's afraid of it. Gradually, he becomes more and more afraid of it. I was yet withheld from doing so, that is, from attacking it, partly by my memory of a former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, to admit, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to admit that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of its merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. So he says he's terrified of the cat, and he's so afraid of the cat, he's even ashamed to admit now that he was afraid of the cat. And what scared him about it was that by slow degrees, nearly imperceptible, in which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous, distinct outline. It was the representation of an object that I shuddered to name, and for this above all I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows, of the mournful and terrible engine of horror and crime, of agony and death. So the white blotch, which was indistinct, now has taken on the shape of the gallows. Why? What's going to happen to him?
He's going to die.
He's going to be hung on the gallows for killing his wife. This is a premonition. When he looks at that gallows, he has a premonition of what he's going to do. And it's supernatural. Of course, modern readers look at it. Now, when the 19th century read this, they would believe, at least partly, that maybe the cat was demonic. That it really was evil. And that it's what drove him crazy, rather than the alcohol. I mean, he keeps giving reasonable explanation for things, but he's a romantic. So deep down, they believe evil is in the world. We would look at it, so he's beginning to hallucinate now, and his own guilt is making him see the gallows on it. Insufferable woe. You know, again, the author is trying to tell you how you ought to feel. I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face and its vast weight. An incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent internally upon my heart. So now the cat gets on its chest and looks at him while he's sleeping and breathes on him. And it gives him nightmares. And every time his eyes open, there's the big cat sitting on his chest. No wonder he's getting crazy. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates. The darkest, the most evil of thoughts, the moodiness of my usual temper increased to the hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I've now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual, most patient of sufferers. So now he's begun to beat up his wife. She doesn't leave him. She doesn't reproach him. She's pure innocence. She says probably, although we don't hear it, that, oh, he can't help himself. He doesn't really mean to do this. So again, she's absolute good. Then, of course, we have her being set up again as the symbol for innocence in the world. And he's abandoned himself absolutely to evil. He doesn't even try to resist it anymore. The cat followed me down the steep stairs and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But the blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by her interference into a rage more than demonic, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. Axe murders were a lot more common in the 19th century. Why?
Didn't have easy access to guns.
They didn't have, well, they had guns, but they didn't have maybe they didn't have as many as we have. But everybody had an axe. Everybody chopped wood for their stove. So they had an axe outside, and they also, sometimes they would split them into smaller pieces in the house. There was always a hatchet around if there wasn't an axe. domestic violence, people kill people with whatever comes to hand, and so there happen to be a lot of axes. So when he mentions an axe murder, it's not as bizarre and unlikely as it is to us. That's one of the scary things about Poe for the 19th century reader, is that murders are not the result of exotic circumstances. This event could have occurred in almost any household in America. And the fact that it could, and the fact that the real evil here is madness, and that anybody could go mad, is what terrified people. That's one of the things that Poe does, is he begins to shift the story from its romantic backgrounds in the emotions and move it over to the psychological. Takes it out of the supernatural and begins to move it towards the psychological. The more stories he writes, the more the psychology of the murderer becomes the real focus of the story. In other words, in a pure romantic story, at the end, we would find out that the cat really was a demon. The last thing we would see was that it comes into his cell, and it comes by the window, and then it materializes into a person. And the jailer comes in and says, how did he get in there? So we know that it was a demon all along. That doesn't happen. Poe moves it over into madness. And it's the madness of the intellect. What we have here is really, by the end of the story, the same villain that you find over and over again in romantic stories, and that is the mad scientist. The person who becomes all intellect. And at the end of the story, he has no more emotions left. So obviously he can't tell good from evil. Now, he's killed his wife in the heat of emotions. But as soon as he does that, to show you that he's beyond redemption, he becomes completely intellectual. What does he do with the body?
There, he hides it.
He hides it. Now he doesn't drag it out and bury it in the backyard. He devises a plan. He searches through the house. He realizes there's this little alcove that he can use, that he can. The plaster's relatively recent. He can take it down. He can put her body in there. He can plaster it all back up. And he's very precise about it. And he becomes the cold-blooded character that cut out the eye of the cat. He becomes all intellect, which is about as evil as you can get for the Romantics. And you notice when he's telling us about this, he's not horrified by it. He's proud of how bright he was, how intelligent he was, how the intellect took over. So he walls her up. And then there's no remorse at all. Instead, it's a problem solved. You can't find the cat, of course. It's impossible to describe or imagine the deep, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into my house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept with the burden of murder upon my soul. Because he doesn't feel anything anymore. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. People ask him where his wife is. He says that's, he has an excuse for that. She went away. She's visiting relatives. She's gone. Whatever it was that he told them. I looked upon my future facility as secured. But after about 4 days, he's not even thinking about it anymore. And the police show up. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was so strong, too strong to be restrained. I burned to say but one word by way of triumph, to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltiness. You notice it's that perverseness that comes back? The police come, they search the house, he tells them, look anywhere you want. He goes down the cellar with them, walks back and forth. He's not upset. He's not giving himself away in any way. They're about to leave. All he has to do is keep his mouth shut. That's the very last thing he ought to do, is do anything to call attention to himself. So what's the one thing he's certain to do? Call attention to himself. Gentlemen, I said at last as the party ascended the steps, I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house. In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These wells, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together. And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon the very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. Of all places, he could have banged on the wall. Again, calling attention to it. It's that perverseness that he talks about earlier. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the archfiend. No sooner had the reverberations of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child. What's the saddest thing a romantic can think of? A crying child, innocence abused. And then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony and of the demons that exult in their damnation. Of my thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant, the party upon the stairs remained motionless through extremity of terror and awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red, extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled up the monster within the tomb. What monster?
The cat.
The cat. The cat. And you notice he doesn't say, I accidentally walled up the cat. The cat made him do it. The cat made him kill his wife. The cat made him wall her up. The cat was responsible. It's a demonic, evil cat. Which shows you what about him?
He's insane.
He's insane. Poe never tells us, he lets him tell it to us himself. And of course that's even scarier because through a good portion of the story, we're reading thinking the narrator is just a regular, ordinary person, which of course he is. He's also a madman. And if you can't tell a madman from somebody who isn't mad in a story, how can you do it in real life? And so all day long you may be bumping into maniacs and not knowing it. You're in jeopardy all the time. The simplest and most mundane instant of in daily life can have within it all of this terror and horror. So he takes it out of the supernatural and he brings it in to everyday life. Now you got to be afraid that the next person you talk to, who seems perfectly sane, is as mad as this guy who told you the story. And how do you know which of the people you bump into in a day is going to be the one who turns out to be the homicidal maniac and murders you? So at the end of the story, he's supposed to have left you terrified. We also have the murder of innocence. We have the intellect getting in the way of repentance. We have all the things that you would expect out of a romantic story. We have the descriptions of what he feels in order to control what we feel. We have the idealized characters in his wife. She's perfectly good and innocent. He's not quite the idealized villain. Usually in a romantic story, the villain is just plain evil. This guy isn't evil, he's crazy. You have to have a little bit of sympathy for him. Not a whole lot, but at least a little bit. Because he's not really in control of himself. Again, we have the first-person narrator. If a third-person narrator tells us about the guy being insane, when is he going to know? When is the narrator going to know that the murderer was insane?
When he first got the cat's eyes.
Certainly by then. The narrator would actually know right from the beginning of the story. So he'd have to tell us up front, this guy is crazy. But by having a first-person narrator, he doesn't know he's insane. At the end of the story, he's telling us the cat did it, the cat did it. We figure out that he's crazy. That makes it much more intense. And again, that's what the first-person narrator is supposed to do. We have the long, flowery descriptions, even when we get to the corpse, about how it's matted with gore. And then the long description of the cat with its red mouth open and its flaming eyes. Also intended to stir up the emotion by stirring up the sensation. The plot is complex. We don't know until the very end of the story that he's mad, although we have some suspicions all along. We find out what happened to the cat. We find out what happened to the wife. We know what's going to happen to the narrator. He's going to be hung. So we have closure. All the loose ends are tied up. Cosmic and supernatural landscapes. In this case, the cat is part of the landscape. It's not an ordinary cat. It's a supernatural cat. It's a demonic cat. Even though you know he's crazy, if you believe in the physical presence of evil in the world, there's just the tiniest little bit of doubt. Because after all, we would assume that we have to accept the rational explanation. Enthusiastic. You can't get much more enthusiastic than this. If you ever hear an actor read this thing, it just gets more, his voice will get more and more intense the longer the story goes on. And it starts out, just the rhythm of the prose is very excited. So we have a lot of emotional involvement by the narrator in what goes on. Finally, symbolic truth, intuitive action. You'd have to look at this, and if it frightens you, then Poe would have to say, then I've told you the truth. You've recognized emotionally something is true about human nature, that we all have this perverseness, that we all do the wrong thing, and that there's an irresistible urge in us to do this, and it can't be overcome. So the real monster isn't so much supernatural as psychological, but for a 19th century person, that's even scarier. Because if external evil is what causes you to do terrible things, you at least have external good to try to get in to prevent that. But if the evil is inherent in human beings, if it's part of human nature, there's nothing much you can do about that. And everybody that you talk to, everybody there is, can turn out to be the murderer from the Black Cat. Anybody have any questions on the stories or on romantic prose? Okay.